something called the 6 degrees of separation theory, which basically states that everyone in the world is separated by, at most, 6 steps. Well, I am separated from Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails mastermind, by just 1 step, and it was due to a stalker. Back in 2006, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had just joined a pretty particular punk band, which mixed a very large sound with cabaret-like visuals. We never made it big, but our act was appealing enough that it got us the attention of many people. One of them was a strange girl, who was always chain-smoking, had a weird aura to herself, and who was always wearing a jacket on her shoulders, meaning her arms were not in the sleeves, and who eventually said she wanted to be our manager. She said she was friends with Slash, Guns N' Roses, that she had managed a couple of bands when she used to live in New Orleans, and whatnot. So we decided to hear her out. Our band was sort of a crazy one, so drugs passed around freely in our parties. This girl, she told us her name was Christy something, would provide us with party favors sometimes, would tell us that she was worth $2 million, that she had 5 scars, that she worked in this luxury building, and that she had a huge house somewhere in the suburbs. The thing is, she was always picking cigarette butts from the street and smoking the filters, like she was a homeless person. Something about her just didn't click particularly with me. She always came to see us in a sort of fancy SUV, so we went along with her stories, for the most part. Eventually, Christy fell hard for me, told me she was divorcing her husband and that she wanted to be with me. I was intrigued by her, so I started testing all her stories. I asked to visit her at her office, and she would always make excuses as to why I couldn't, until eventually she told me her office had closed down, and that they were looking for new space. I asked her why she was using the same car if she had like 5, and again, excuses and more excuses. I asked to visit her at her huge house, the same thing. She came up with off reasons as to why she couldn't have me for a visit, mostly that her husband was still there and whatnot. I started to get sick of all her excuses and eventually confronted her, that I thought that she was a big fat liar. She got desperate, started to make more excuses, and I just told her to get lost. She had had a previous fight with some of my bandmates before, so she had already been discarded as our prospective manager. She started calling me every day, asking to see me. I would constantly tell her no until one day she showed up at my house around 5 a.m., apparently wasted. She said she had picked up this guy friend of hers to go party, but that he was too drunk, and that he was now passed out in her car, and she didn't know what to do with him. I looked across the street and saw no one in her car, and she said it was because this guy was laying down. I didn't really feel like bothering and going to her car to check it out. She eventually started crying, and I felt bad enough for her that I let her come into my living room. It was at this point that she took off her jacket, and for the first time ever, I realized she was missing her entire left arm. I was already giddy by her showing up at my house drunk and all, that I didn't dare ask how that happened. I know this has nothing to do with my story, but it was something that just added to the already weirded out atmosphere. I hung out with her for a while. At this point, I started doubting that she was actually drunk. I gave her coffee. I told her to please never show up at my house like that again, and eventually told her to just drop the guy at a Waffle House, and then just go home. It might not have been the most responsible thing to tell someone in that state to drive, but I just wanted the whole thing to be over, and like I said, I felt that she was acting drunk the whole time, and she seemed okay enough to drive. She eventually left, and that was that for that night. Next day, again she started stalking me by phone, to the point I just stopped picking up. I worked early hours, and she would call me at 2 or 3 a.m. completely drunk. I eventually got sick of it all, and told her to stay away from me, and to never call me again. She complied, and for about a week, it seemed like the whole thing was history. Around 6 days later, she calls me again when I was at work. I started telling her that she wasn't supposed to call me, but she said that she could finally invite me to her house, and that she wanted me to come visit her. All sorts of red flags went up for me, so of course, I told her to forget about it, and just hung up on her. She again started calling me at late hours, to the point that I just had to turn off my phone at night. Otherwise, I would never get a good night's sleep. I remember it was a Friday. After waking up, I had a voicemail on my phone, left at around 2 a.m. I checked it out, and it was her saying, "Hi Max, I just took 200 pills and I've been drinking all night. I just wanted to say goodbye and that I love you. Good luck with the rest of your life." Needless to say, I got totally weirded out. I was so sick of her lies. I just deleted the message, completely assuming it was one of her ploys to get me to call her. I decided to forget about it and went to work. Next Tuesday after that, I get another voicemail from her phone. But this time it was a guy's voice. "Hi Max, this is Christy's husband. I'm calling her friends in her contact list to let them know that she passed away last Friday. And we're doing a memorial for her in downtown Atlanta tomorrow. If you want to go, please call me back so I can give you the address." Can't even explain how I felt at that point. I was shocked. And I tried to evade the news by thinking that this was some guy that Christy had manipulated into calling me, just to get me somewhere at some time. But of course, the whole situation didn't make much sense to me. This guy eventually called another of my bandmates, whose name was in Christy's contact list. I told my band about this entire situation, so my bandmate, who had been suspicious of this girl for a while, started prying this guy for more info. We eventually learned that she used a fake name with us the whole time, that her real name was Amber Applebaum, and that she was using a made-up name because she had been in trouble with the law. We googled her, and sure enough, turns out she had stalked Trent Reznor in the past, and even managed to steal his credit card info. She even was arrested for it. I was stunned at this point, unsure of what to do next. We never went to the memorial. We were way too suspicious to do it. To this day, I still don't know if this girl committed suicide for real or if the whole thing was just a sham to get me into some trouble. But since I never heard from her again, I doubt it. Or maybe she's been using a fake name ever since and decided to move on with her life. I'll never know. But it's definitely the worst way to get 1 degree of separation from someone famous. I got rid of my cell phone after that, and it took me 3 years until I felt okay enough to get a new one. I never really want to go through something like that ever again. I'm a male, and was around 17 at the time this story takes place, on a winter's night in a small town in southern England. I was over at a friend's house for a few drinks, as we were too young to hit the pubs, and the weather too cold to drink in the woods as usual. My friend lived around 2 miles from where I lived, and around halfway home, there was a shortcut through the woods, where we regularly hung out, which would shave a precious few minutes off my walk home. We were having a good time, and enjoying a few cans of cider. I think it's a rite of passage for English youth. And at around 11 p.m, I decided to head home as I had work the next morning. I headed out of my friend's house and through the alleyway to the main road. It was here that I noticed someone on the other side of the road, about half a mile back. I thought nothing of it. It's a quiet town, and I had made this walk plenty of times before without issue. As I started walking, I felt an odd sensation, and the hairs on my neck started to stand on end. I turned around to see the person had crossed the road and was now walking on the same side of the road as me. Still a way behind, but I could see it was a large man with a hooded top on. Being a relatively switched-on person, I decided to cross the road to see if he copied me. No sooner had I done that, sure enough, the man followed suit. At this point, I started to nope out and walk faster. I kept checking behind me, and he too was walking faster. And there was a glint of something in his hand. Now, it could well have been anything, but my brain was telling me this guy had a knife. I continued walking until I was around 100 meters away from the shortcut. Now I had a decision to make. Do I take the shortcut through the woods, or do I continue another half mile towards the main road, where there were likely cars? As I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in those woods, and felt that I would at least have a chance to lose this guy in there. Looking back, and the guy was now around 200 meters behind me, and getting fast. My fight or flight kicked in, and I started sprinting towards the gate of the shortcut. Now the shortcut was a small unlit dirt road, wide enough for a car to fit down, with back gardens on one side, long grass on the other, and tree roots littering the path. As I rounded the gate onto the path, I checked back, and the man was fully sprinting behind me. I got about 10 meters down the path, and tripped on one of the roots, falling flat on my face. Part darkness, part alcohol is to blame, I would say. Knowing I had seconds to make a decision on what to do before he got to the gate. I didn't think I could get up and go quick enough. Plus my knee was shot after falling down. I did the first thing that came to my mind, and I rolled off the path and into the tall grass that lay there, trying to be as silent and still as possible. A moment later, I heard the gate rattle and someone walk up the path behind me. Unable to see, as I was laying on my front facing forward, I prayed that he did not spot me. The man lingered for a moment around 4 feet away from where I was laying, catching his breath. He was breathing really heavy, and I could tell he was straining his eyes to see down the path in the dark. After what felt like eternity, he started walking off down the path, and I watched him go as far as I could see in the dark. My heart was beating fast, and the adrenaline was pumping through my body. I had sobered up very fast, and was now acutely aware of every single noise in the woods. I waited around 10 minutes after I last saw him before getting slowly to my feet. I very slowly made my way towards the road, listening carefully for any noises that were out of place in the woods, and keeping a low profile, moved back towards the gate. As I reached the gate, I heard a loud bang behind me. I spun around and saw a black cat had just jumped onto one of the fences. No sign of the man. I made my way onto the road and managed to get home without any further incident. Needless to say, I was incredibly wary whenever we returned to the woods for a drink. Potential knife-wielding murderer. Let's not meet. So a little background story. I am an athletic 19-year-old female. I was 18 when it happened. I live in a really small town with maybe less than 10,000 residents, and there are no streetlights where I live. Basically, everyone has an outside light on their front yards, and at night time they have to turn it on to provide lights for the street. And believe me, it doesn't light up that much. Anyways, it was around May of last year when it happened, and since I have a very hard time falling asleep, I used to go on nighttime joggings all the time between 1 and 3 a.m. It helped me fall asleep. My boyfriend and dad were always really concerned about that because it didn't sound safe for me to be jogging around the neighborhood super late at night, but like I said, I live in a really small town and I always thought nothing bad could happen to me. Until that night. So, it was a normal night. Kind of cold since I remember having my raincoat on. I tied my shoes and went on my almost daily nighttime jogging routine, I'd say. Probably around 1 or 2 a.m. I ran the same distance and took the same path, but for some reasons, I ran faster than usual and had to take a short walking break to catch my breath. I stopped in front of a park, a couple of streets away from my house, and started walking back toward my house, but that's when I noticed him. He was standing in the middle of the park, with a dog that looked like a husky or something, as big as that. Like I said before, there are no streetlights and no lights in the park either. Plus, the street I was on only had 2 houses, so they were not providing that much light, so I really could not tell if he was looking at me or even facing me at all. Obviously, it kind of shocked me to see someone wandering in a park so late at night, and I was not used to seeing people in the streets around those hours. But I shook it off and kept walking to head back home. But after a few steps ahead, I started to feel uneasy and weirded out. So I looked over my shoulder and I saw him walking behind me, still holding his dog on leash. He was approximately 2 meters behind me. My heartbeat was already high from running, but I felt like it got even higher. I didn't feel safe at all, and even though I tried to keep calm, I just couldn't. So I started running as fast as I could, without even looking behind me, but to my horror, he started running too. I could hear his footsteps behind me. After what felt like ages of sprinting through different streets, I could not take it anymore as I was already exhausted from my jogging, so I turned into a driveway after taking a sharp turn into another street and hid. Crouched behind the bushes of the front yard. Not even 5 seconds later, I heard him take the turn and run past where I was hiding. Thank God. He then stopped running a few meters. I rationally thought he knew where I was, because my heart was beating so hard, I thought he could hear it. In front of where I was, I started looking everywhere, left, right, as if he was looking for someone. And then he finally turned around and I got to see him a little bit better. I definitely cannot tell how old he was, but considering he kept up with my running, he was probably less than 40, or just in really good shape. He was wearing all black, hoodie, pants, and a cap. His dog looked like a husky mixed with something else. He then turned back and started running again. I stayed behind the bush until I could not hear his footsteps anymore. God, I even stayed a good 10 minutes or more or so after that. I was so afraid I didn't want to come out, but I had to because I was still very vulnerable in the streets, and he could have came back any time. I then took all the courage and energy I had left, came out of where I was hiding, and started sprinting back in the opposite direction he had, to head back home, where I made it safely, and promised myself to never run late at night again. Never again. So, Creepy Park guy, let's never meet again.